You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the eighth wonder of the world. That's right, we're talking about King Kong, the original classic 1933 movie. Welcome back to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me, as always, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. The topic of our conversation today, giant apes, one specific, probably the granddaddy of them all, King Kong, Pete.
Wild, weird, wonderful. The stuff for which movies were made. Adventure, to make you wonder if it's true, while your eyes convince you that it is. Truly, the thrill of thrills.
Do you remember watching as a kid at any point the original 1933 King Kong?
Absolutely. We had this in New York. I don't know if you had this growing up in Chicago, but Thanksgiving Day, local New York, I can't remember if it was PIX 11, WR Channel 9, might have been WABC 7. I forget, one of those stations would have King Kong, Son of Kong, and Mighty Joe Young back to back to back on Thanksgiving Day.
Thursday afternoon, see three of the screen's greatest thrillers, starting at 1 with the greatest of them all, the one and only original King Kong. Then the action continues with the Son of Kong, followed by the Mighty Joe Young, a classic tale of Beauty and the Beast. A full afternoon of action and adventure. Thursday afternoon at 1.
And I remember it being kind of not must-watch TV, but once the football games were done, I remember going over aunts and uncles, and I have a very big family. I had tons of cousins, and, when we were all still kind of more centrally located on Long Island, we would have take turns hosting Thanksgiving dinners and things like that. And I remember being over my aunt's one time and with the cousins, and we were all just kind of glued to the TV watching those three things. So that was you could always count on King Kong coming on at least every year on Thanksgiving. It would be part of Monster Weeks and things like that, or Saturday morning or afternoon creature features as well growing up. But specifically, my memory is tied to Thanksgiving. I don't know if you had that similar package out in Chicago where you were growing up, though.
There were channels like Channel 50, Channel 60. They would have something like King Kong that they would air, say at 5 a.m. before something like Ultraman or any of the Godzilla films would air on a Saturday morning. And I think that was the closest thing they could do to compete with Saturday morning cartoons, because they didn't have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they didn't have Ghostbusters, they didn't have Dungeons and Dragons, Transformers, or G.I. Joe, but they could play King Kong. That's what I always remember they were on. But I always remember thinking wow, these look old. They're black and white. They don't look as shiny as Ultraman or Spectre-Man or any of the Godzilla films that at the time just spoke to me as a kid. But I do always remember that with King Kong specifically, the black and white didn't make it feel old. The stop motion of it all. I knew Ray Harryhausen, not by name, but, this is the one with the skeletons. This is Sinbad. This is the Argonauts one. So I kind of put King Kong in that category. It's this is one of those movies, but just the older version of that.
I don't know. For me personally, as a kid, it was really easy for me to suspend disbelief. So, I'm sure on some level I knew what I was watching was, Little Models, done through amazing work by Willis O'Brien in King Kong. To see, the Tyrannosaurus, something that looked pretty lifelike, I guess, 65 million years ago, lifelike. But what we grew up with in the 70s, when you had some pretty janky, sometimes they were man in suit. I'm not talking Godzilla. I'm talking about really rigid, can't remember the name of the movie, but it was Lost World or something like that. There were some really low budget, cheesy 50s and 60s dinosaur movies that were, if you couldn't see the zipper on the back of the suit, it was it was almost as bad. So to kind of see that stop motion work, I can believe that this is a giant ape fighting a Tyrannosaurus right now. This is really cool. Like and not alone, I'm like, King Kong captured the imaginations of so many people when it was released and continues to. There's a reason why it is held up and is considered very much a classic of the genre. It's just, it's a tidy story. It's pretty basic, but you had like these amazing special effects. You had that kind of back screen stuff where you had like the actors in front of like the screen, so they're reacting to things in real time. It wasn't like blue screen or green screen or anything like that. And then, because it's a 30s movie, like the people kind of talk funny, which was kind of interesting in its own way. When you got like Carl Denham, like,
he was a king and a god in the world he knew, but now he comes to civilization, merely a captive, a show to gratify your curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, look at Kong, the eighth wonder of the world.
Kong, eighth wonder of the world. Can you believe it? It's just like that almost like newsreel footage type diction that I think that was added a little extra something to it as well. It seemed, obviously it came from another age, but watching it on, for me, at first was a black and white TV and then quickly a color television in black and white. There's something otherworldly about all of it.
Especially from someone who grew up on Long Island. So it felt like that could be more in your backyard.
Right.
The one thing, too, that's kind of interesting reading about the origins, right, of the 1933 one is like you mentioned, it takes place in the 30s during the Great Depression. The fact that it becomes such a big deal, me, I like the context. And I was like, oh, yeah, what was happening during that time? Oh, yeah, the Great Depression, where like 25% of Americans are unemployed. And yet this becomes super popular. This is before we get all of the Roosevelt like New Deal reforms, like Social Security, all of the safety nets that he's trying to create to help create recovery because of things like the Great Depression, like FDIC, protecting your money in a bank. It's like, hey, let's make this stuff to like help people out because, 1 in every 4 people was not employed. But yet a ton of people found a way to see this movie. This comes out in 33, 2 years before that. It's Frankenstein and Dracula. They're all monsters, right? Like maybe some more sympathetic than others, like Dracula, not played for sympathy. Frankenstein's monster certainly played for more. But you just know that RKO, who puts Kong out, had to have seen the reception for the Universal monsters and thinking about, again, those monsters being founded in literature. They were adapted from something. I had to look up, and I didn't know if you knew this, that Kong wasn't adapted from anything, that it was like an actual like original idea. RKO picks it up. They had put out movies like Top Hat in 35, Bringing Up Baby in 38, Citizen Kane in 41. So like these are movies that are in the like TCM top movies of all time, and here they are. Hey, we're gonna make a giant ape movie with stop motion by, like you mentioned, Willis O'Brien. We're gonna do it just 2 years after all these movies, these horror monsters kind of like come on the scene. It makes me just appreciate the fact that they made this movie and kind of took a chance on what would be like a special effects movie.
Absolutely. It's kind of mind blowing when you think of where you come from. Dracula, which was adapted from a stage play, is shot very much as a play, just on the film, because obviously it was originally a novel by Bram Stoker, but then it had appeared on Broadway. And basically the Dracula, I think, that you see on screen was essentially adapted from that Broadway play. And I think we should give a shout out to the Halloweenies podcast, where I got whatever mangled it may be, I got the information from. They did a deep dive on all the Universal monsters recently, and it's a great. If you've got a lot of hours that you want to listen to podcasts and do some deep dives on these Universal monsters, that is a series to check out. But yeah, to go from that in 31. And then you and I have talked about the makeup work of Jack Pierce, who did, all the if not all, most of the Universal monsters. But that's like makeup effects on human beings. And to go from that to, I don't know if it was done before, what Willis O'Brien was doing with like the animatronic.
I did find that like before David O. Selznick decided to move forward with King Kong, that Willis O'Brien was working on a film for RKO Pictures called Creation. I did find this clip that actually has footage from the original 1931 Creation by Willis O'Brien, and it has some commentary by, I think probably the most appropriate person of all, Ray Harryhausen.
And they did about a year's work, I suppose, at RKO. Willis O'Brien made a number of tests just to show how the animals would move. It was the first time the dinosaurs took on this realistic approach. It's a question of keeping the head and the arms and the legs all in synchronization so that the movement looks natural and not just a stiff puppet that moves around like Pinocchio. O'Brien made stars of the dinosaurs, and I think that was important, that he brought them to life where you can't go out and photograph a dinosaur, so you have to create one.
Some of it obviously was used in King Kong in the 1933 version. Skull Island and the dinosaurs that are kind of portrayed and just kind of creating that sort of like prehistoric landscape. But dinosaur stop motion like Ray Harryhausen, before Ray Harryhausen that we know, he obviously was already into this enough to the point where he'd invested, seems like, a lot of time into something that was kind of the precursor to King Kong.
Because of the time that it was filmed in, like, deep, dark Africa, like the Dark Continent, things like that, there was certainly parts of the world that were little or unexplored, and I think King Kong taps into that. Unfortunately, it also taps into, as was brilliantly depicted in Inglourious Bastards in that one scene, it really brings home the point of like, well, this is just taking African Americans off of the continent and enslaving them, bringing them back to civilization to, quote, civilize them. So certainly don't think that was anyone's overt intention in making it, but like it's kind of hard to ignore. Certainly in the 30s, it's just there. So I don't want to not give voice to that because that's a problem. But we're gonna keep it lighter because there is a lot of positives to also dwell on with King Kong, the 33. But yeah, like
I would say it does make sense too, because you have to think like Frankenstein comes out before that. The whole like man versus nature stuff is there. There's stuff that's happening in this movie. There's stuff that's happening in Dracula with how people see certain cultures. With a lot of these movies, they're still always inevitably products of their time.
To jump off of that point, like there's also that dichotomy of the untamed versus modern society when you have Kong transported to New York. And you and I spoke a little while back with Michelle Brittany about some of these films that were shot around then. One of them about was called Manhattan, which was essentially about the island of Manhattan, and it was just kind of really showcasing, because at this time in the 30s, much of America is still a very rural society, so people are starting to flock to cities, but the population is still mostly farmers and people living outside of cities. So to see something like the Empire State Building, which had recently been built, I think right before King Kong comes out, a new building, and just kind of highlighting the modernity of like this modern age. And it's like, when you think back of the time frame, you pointed out, we're coming out of the Great Depression. We are just a few short years from the rise of fascism in Europe. So you've got like this really small window here of, okay, we made it through the Great Depression. Germany, Italy, that's a couple years off. It probably bubbling right now, but like we can kind of just focus on, oh, isn't it great? We have these modern cities. I think the biplanes that end up like attacking Kong at the end are kind of considered like, oh, this is state of the art. Like there's flight. We can fly planes now too. So there's like that weird dichotomy of how it starts out. Literally, you're looking at prehistoric animals, and then you get to the modern city, and the adaptation or the inability to adapt of Kong being thrust into such a foreign world that he can't possibly comprehend or make sense of. And then the tragedy, of course, of, him falling from the Empire State Building at the end, like, even though it's a puppet, even though it's, stop motion animation, the heartstrings still get tugged at there, because I think most empathetic people understand that, King Kong, although considered a monster and does monstrous things and kills people and all of that, like it's not really his fault in the end. Like, he's been placed here. He doesn't want to be here. And, you know, he's unfortunately a victim of circumstance and a victim of the charms of Fey Ray.